Welcome to the Association of State Floodplain Managers Annual Conference. This session is the Floodplain Management Initiative session, and I am your moderator, Lisa Sherrard. Our first presentation is Josh Lippert. Josh is the City Floodplain Manager with the City of Philadelphia, and he chairs the city's Flood Risk Management Task Force. And we have Josh's presentation now.
Good afternoon. You are attending the Interdependencies in Floodplain Management, a case study in Philadelphia. I'm Josh Lippert, the Floodplain Manager for the City of Philadelphia. This presentation will examine the efforts of the City of Philadelphia to understand the cascading impacts of floodplain management on interconnected operations in capital improvement systems at the urban scale. It highlights how the identification of floodplain management interdependencies and impacts of flooding can serve as a first step in reducing flood risk to the city infrastructure, property, and life. Before we dive into the interdependencies, let's both look nationally and within Philadelphia at the state of flooding to highlight some of the key challenges. These are some recent news headlines associated with the challenges we face as floodplain managers. The first being how hurricane season and the current COVID-19 health crisis are set to collide in the United States, and the other dealing with the topic of NFIP reform in the context of how regulations are not being enforced in cities across the United States. Additionally, the topics of education and mitigation, the first around disclosures and homeowners and how housing values are vastly overvalued in flood-prone areas, perpetuating the repetitive losses we see around the country. The second highlighting the current presidential administration's response for mitigation involving evictions of homeowners in floodplains, highlighting the need to explore the range of mitigation options we have available and the impacts on our communities and the sense of place. Contrasted to some of the Philadelphia challenges related to compound environmental threats, not only do we have areas of high flood risk, those same areas have sinking homes due to geotechnical issues. So in some cases are Superfund sites. In other cases are active hazardous industrial manufacturing uses. Additionally, we have new infrastructure being proposed, such as electrical substations in our floodways and floodplains along some of our most flood-prone rivers. Compounded by the fact that city departments and agencies over the past several decades through planning and commerce activities have pushed development into these flood-prone areas. One example of this is the land given to the city by the U.S. Navy, known as the Navy Yard in Philadelphia, which has quickly become a suburban office park with expansion into residential uses. The issue being that commerce has advertised these areas for businesses, often incentivizing businesses' relocation here with tax abatements and other subsidies, with disregard to the drastic flood risk as well as sea level rise implications. But we also have some good news in terms of our nationally known Green Cities Clean Waters Plan to adhere to the EPA's consent decree for our combined sewer overflows. This program is transforming our waterways as well as implementing green stormwater infrastructure citywide. But it is too not without challenges for floodplain management, being that it's primarily focused in solving combined sewer overflow reduction. That's why we are now looking to expand upon the Green Cities Clean Waters Plan to examine larger scale land use changes that could result in relocating city residents to meet both the consent decree, but also flood relief goals. In Philadelphia, we synthesize flooding into four fairly easily communicated categories, or what we call our flood types. The first being riverine flooding that occurs along our city's creeks, streams, and rivers. The second being our coastal floodplain, that being along our Delaware River, which is tidally influenced, as well as has the threat of hurricanes accompanied with storm surge. One report stating that more than $2 billion worth of damage may occur in the event of a Category 1 hurricane hitting the city of Philadelphia. The third type of flooding being that of infrastructure, or otherwise known nationally as urban flooding, which poses some of the most problematic flood risk for Philadelphians. Flooding that is incurred by intense precipitation, often overwhelming city combined sewer infrastructure, causing roadways to flood like rivers and basements to back up. By FEMA's repetitive loss numbers, more than half of Philadelphia's 1,100 losses are in these unmapped or Zone X areas. In some cases, these areas are 4+ miles away from any sort of daylit creek or stream. Mainly, these areas exist in locations where pre-year 1700, Philadelphia had 300 miles of creeks and streams. Those are now replaced by over 3,000 miles of combined sewer infrastructure. And finally, the threat of chronic and sea level rise due to climate change, in particular impacting our Delaware River, including our international airport, which is predicted to experience 6 feet of inundation by year 2100. Putting this in the context of our regulatory frameworks, that being the NFIP, sea level rise has been downsampled and mapped for Philadelphia in 2015, but is not regulated by any zoning or building codes, whereas both riverine and coastal flooding is regulated by the National Flood Insurance Program. And finally, infrastructure flooding, or also known as urban flooding, that is known to occur in various parts of the city due to resident complaints, but is largely unmapped and thus unregulated by zoning or building codes. This slide specifically looking at the challenges associated with floodplain management in the urban context, the push and pull of competing city systems, the economics of growth of a city versus the long-term environmental sustainability or resiliency, the desire of people to live near water, and the historic land use patterns of building near or even on top of waterways. And finally, the unexpected priorities, whether it being public health crises like COVID-19 or civil unrest. All of this to say it takes collaborative integration and a shared vision to tackle a variety of flood management challenges in our cities. In Philadelphia, we have operational and physical infrastructure interdependencies in floodplain management to protect the life, safety, and property. Physical infrastructure sectors include streets, waters, buildings, water supply, etc., as they are critical to security, economic prosperity, and social well-being of communities. Whereas operational infrastructure interdependencies are services and programs to support the quality of life. Examples of these would be the streets department would need to close a street, and the Office of Emergency Management would need to be interdependent to notify the public about these closures and the emergency evacuation routes alterations. Philadelphia's approach to understanding and communicating flood management interdependencies has ranged from initial engagement or relationship building with city departments and agencies, as well as state and federal agencies, through traditional educational seminars to more hands-on workshops in which participants from various sectors have mapped these interconnections through discussion and drawings. This approach has been done in the confines of the citywide flood risk management task force that was formed in 2015 in response to some of the national flood emergencies that had occurred. This is an example of the cascading impacts of before, during, and after a flood. The activities in the city departments or agencies that play a role in each preparedness, response, and recovery activity. In Philadelphia, we have operation physical interdependencies related to capital improvements and operations of the city. An example during a flood is mainly operational interdependencies, but before and after a flood, physical interdependencies take place. Based on a review of the city's efforts to understand flood risk, to interdependent city operations, and develop and implement flood management strategies, some best practices and lessons learned have emerged, which can be useful for other city governments and others considering instituting flood mitigation planning efforts. These practices and lessons apply to 3 main stages: facilitating engagement, collective action, mapping flood risk, and operational interdependencies, and enabling development and implementation of management strategies. Some key things here are visualizing the connections, the links, the dependencies and interdependencies between organizations, departments, and agencies, recognizing the links, connections, and where failures may occur, using specific flood hazard mapping scenarios to develop a detailed understanding of the cascading risks faced by the interdependent city operations, recognizing that different city agencies may have different risk tolerances, developing a common or shared understanding of collective flood risk between the various departments and agencies to provide a basis for cooperation and coordination. And then finally, identifying areas of common risk between the departments and agencies, overlapping or common responsibilities, as well as if there's any gaps to addressing these risks. Data sharing among city agencies, state and federal agencies has been crucial in facilitating the strategic planning for flood impacts. Philadelphia has undertaken collaborative risk assessments in developing and prioritizing strategies to mitigate the impacts of flooding on interdependent city systems. From this analysis and a handful of best practices and recommendations for city agencies have identified in the process of engaging and facilitating collective action. Conducting preliminary analysis of flood risk to interdependent city services and developing and implementing tailored mitigation strategies. Data has to be at scale to be actionable, and science should be congruent for comparison purposes. In some cases, high-level data can be used for planning purposes, but more detailed data, and in most cases, parcel-level data is needed to implement flood preparedness and management strategies at a department or agency level. Implementation cannot be done without planning and funding. An integral part is plan integration, and in this example, the city's flood risk strategic plan, the city's resiliency plan, and its hazard mitigation plan. The hazard mitigation plan being the plan that can leverage state and federal funding for many preparedness and flood mitigation projects. And on the flip side, identifying plans that need upgrades or updates to integrate more broadly. Both a detailed waterfront master plan and the city's comprehensive vision plan developed in circa 2010 failed to address floodplain management and pose the need to prepare and mitigate for flood risk. To highlight a floodplain management project and its interdependencies, we'll look at a historic preservation and flood resiliency project for one of the most visited parks in the city of Philadelphia, which is the site of a historic inn that has experienced severe losses of several hundreds of thousands of dollars in the last decade. The overall goal of this pilot project was to test the city's appetite to retain a sense of place in the face of flood resiliency. Through a unique partnership with the state's Historic Preservation Office, utilizing Hurricane Sandy funding, the city and the state were able to conduct a 3-phase flood resiliency program. The first consisting of a day-long workshop where there was training and site analysis to develop a shared understanding of the historic preservation and flood resiliency. The second phase was to have the attendees of the workshop develop designs through what we called a design charrette, mitigation solutions to tackle flood resiliency, but retain the sense of place. And finally, creating a flood resiliency plan, an operations response and recovery plan for during and after flood events. What made this so unique was the integration of interdisciplinary design professionals. We had preservationists, architects, landscape architects, urban planners, and engineers, to name a few, on a scope that was rather unique in Philadelphia, being that it encompassed flood preparedness, flood mitigation, and flood emergency operations planning. Here you'll see a diagram of the city department and agencies, state and federal agencies, and their interdependent roles in planning, design, and implementation of floodplain management strategies for this historic asset. Some lessons learned was that we understood that existing context, roles, responsibilities, and decision-making process, recognizing the collective efforts to address interdisciplinary with a more effective and sustained when each help each organization fulfill its own objectives and secure its own operations and assets, creating a safe space to promote the sharing of infrastructure risk. While Philadelphia has recognized the importance of factoring infrastructure interdependencies into floodplain management and flood risk assessments, it has begun to analyze the cascading impacts of flood risk and interconnected systems. In many cases, this analysis needs refinement, particularly in identifying failure points among complex systems. Further work is needed to develop and implement flood risk mitigation strategies. That work includes the role that technology plays in risk assessments, how to further detail critical links and failure points at a more granular scale, how to implement mitigation strategies through the use of risk analysis, and how financial models can be used for implementation and the promotion of this flood mitigation. In conclusion, bringing the conversation back around to the need to strike a balance between the competing priorities. For instance, the lessons learned from COVID-19 health crisis is already showing the globe that emissions can be curbed for environmental good, but at the expense of the economy. With these lessons, we can refocus floodplain management to balance the scales, learning, adapting, and growing through exploring the interdependencies that exist within our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh, for a wonderful presentation. We want to thank you all for your participation in today's event. Josh is with us to make some closing remarks of his presentation. As a reminder, if you type in your questions in the Q&A, we'll be able to ask Josh firsthand, and so you'll have his answers and personal response. Josh?
Yes. Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending the presentation about interdependencies and floodplain management in Philadelphia. It was intended to be a look into a city network, specifically Philadelphia, and the necessity to work within your local, state, and federal partners and collaborators, and looking at those interdependencies and how you can learn, adapt, and grow a floodplain management program within those. We've by no means figured it all out here in Philadelphia. We continue to grow those connections and those collaborations. And we look forward to working within those networks as well as with everyone else in the floodplain management community to grow this information regarding interdependencies. So I'll stick around if anyone has any questions. I'll be available in the chat box.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Josh, for your remarks. Our next presenter is Clair Davis. Clair is a FEMA NFIP program lead with the city of Fort Worth, where she manages the rural flood and erosion hazard identification, risk communication, and outreach programs. Clair is speaking with us today on developing a program to manage non-FEMA flood risks in Fort Worth, Texas.
Good afternoon. My name is Clair Davis. I'm the floodplain administrator for the city of Fort Worth. I'm here today presenting on how we're developing a program to manage non-FEMA flood risk in the city of Fort Worth, Texas. Our agenda today is going to have 7 topics. We're going to cover some historic flooding in Fort Worth, look at the flooding that's going on outside the FEMA floodplains, look at some of the benchmarking we've done to prepare our program for dealing with it on a policy basis, take a look at the major issues and concerns that we found as part of our benchmarking, and then also internally look at our stakeholder engagement that we prepared to really address these issues, cover the recommendations that we're going to make, and take a look at our next steps. And so when you've got a city like ours, any city that's got a confluence of 2 major rivers right in the middle of the town, you're going to have some flooding issues, and Fort Worth is just like that. We've got photos here from 1922. It was a pretty major flood there. It overtopped the levees. You can see that thin line of levee that crosses from left to right, right behind the bridge there. It's got water on both sides of the levees there. Also, Marine Creek is a large tributary to the Trinity River in this area. It goes right through the stockyard, the historic part of town, and it's always created substantial economic impacts until there were some flood control measures installed. And then also what we would consider the flood of record for Fort Worth, the May 17th, 1949 flood that overtopped the levees that were improved after the 1922 storm, and then resulted in major flooding in a residential and commercial area just north of Main Street right there. And this is what you're looking at, the old Montgomery Ward's building. It's flooded up to about the second floor, according to this photo. And you can see, obviously, the homes are up to the rooftops. But we're going to focus on the flooding outside the special flood hazard area. These are two areas of town that are that type of flooding is going on. You got Main Street and very near this location on the top, and University Drive comes in right in this area as well. There's lots of flooding that comes right down through here, and then there's some construction that's exacerbating that situation. In the lower photo is new construction in a older part of town, kind of an infill development situation where the developers were not aware of the flood risk in this location, and the new townhomes are up to the garages with water inside the garages of several of those new structures. One of the tools I use as a floodplain administrator for the city is to reference the NFIP claim and insurance policy location information that we get annually. And we prepared this table as a part of our stormwater management and floodplain management plan for the city. And what we found as part of the rip loss area analysis of the plan was that of our rip loss areas, only 7 of them were inside the FEMA floodplain, 31 were located outside the FEMA floodplain. The rip loss properties, we had 10 in the FEMA floodplain and 39 outside. And from a claim dollar perspective, 36% of our claim dollars are going inside the floodplain for the FEMA floodplains, 64% going outside the FEMA floodplain. So in a nutshell, we really got more flooding outside the FEMA floodplain than in. When it comes to trying to deal with the FEMA floodplains or these non-FEMA floodplains, we've developed a couple of tools. One of them we call the city flood risk areas, which is a 2D model based on storm drain capacity and overland flow. And then the potential high water areas, which is a lower level of detail, but also still 2D and a good representation of where the natural flow of water goes. We use these to map the areas that are not in the FEMA floodplains, and it gives us a good idea of where the real risk areas are located. This is in part due to the tremendous amount of information we developed after our utility was created in 2006. We did a lot of these studies to help scope and plan for capital projects, and really try to deal with some of the situations that have resulted in 80% of our multiple insurance claims being located outside the floodplain in these storm drain related areas. And we also found that the flood risk is really just too expensive to mitigate through capital projects alone. So we need to really focus on advising the public and then installing some sort of regulation to prevent future damages for new development in these areas. This is one cause for the local floodplains in Fort Worth. We've got a plan set from 1925. This is the improvements to the existing storm drain system where they're replacing a 10-foot wooden inlet with a 10-foot concrete inlet. That's not a lot of capacity change, but it is a material change. And also shown on this map is a little line that goes through these lots that showed as the ravine, which is the natural stream flow line that flow through the area regardless of where the lots were platted or the streets were laid out. It's also interesting to note that on this particular sheet, there are 6 3-foot inlets at the intersection of Ryan Avenue and Robert Street. The future storm drain improvements that came along in 1995 replaced those inlets with 3 10-foot inlets and 5 16-foot inlets. So it's a huge amount of capacity that was installed in this location with a parallel storm drain in 1995, only 70 years after it was originally constructed. There's another area that's characteristic of non-FEMA floodplains. We refer to this as our central Arlington Heights area. This area that's circled. There's also an eastern and western Arlington Heights that are all studied in a similar way. What you're seeing in blue is not FEMA floodplain. It's the non-FEMA or the potential high water area in this situation. We've also modeled these areas in 2D. So we've got a detailed storm drain analysis that shows what's going on. But the big deal is that there's no FEMA floodplain in this area, but clearly a lot of drainage. And another aspect of what's going on is that frequently the streets in Fort Worth are arranged on a north-south, east-west arrangement, kind of a typical street grid that you find in a lot of older cities. The streams are not arranged on the same grid system, so they end up cutting through the streets where there'll be a low point in the middle of a block. We call those a mid-block sump, and this is where some of the worst flooding goes on. You can see in the photos on the left kind of what that mid-block sump looks like. And these happen to be two photos almost directly across the street from each other, but it clearly shows that the street is fully flooded beyond the right-of-way from house to house. And the photo on the bottom is actually a new construction, and that home has flooded several times within the last several years, in spite of providing some of this information to the builder. On the mapping side, this is kind of more familiar, what everybody is used to seeing, the FEMA maps that are in GIS. We use these to help communicate flood risk, and we use it for our permitting process. We've got 50 square miles of FEMA floodplain in the city, and looking at this map, you wouldn't know that there was any sort of flood risk outside of those blue FEMA flood zones. However, when we turn on the potential high water in pink and the city flood risk areas in green, you can tell that there's a lot more flood risk than is shown on the FEMA flood maps. Here with the potential high water, it's a lower level of detail, and everything is at least 6 inches deep to show up on this map. The city flood risk areas are more detailed, so it's a little bit narrower floodplain because it reflects some of the storm drain capacity that the potential high water does not. Citywide, we've got 65 square miles of potential high water, and right now only 3 square miles of the city flood risk area mapped. This information is available to the public right now in very limited ways. We've got mapping on our city's one address application that's on the city's main homepage. There's a little window you can add in any valid city of Fort Worth address, and it'll reply with all the important information you want if you're looking for information on properties in the city, zip codes, what school district you're in, who your council member is, and also whether or not you're within 100 feet of a floodplain and whether or not you're exposed to this potential high water risk. If you mouse over those little information bubbles, it gives you a little pop-up that tells you who to contact if you're in one of those risk areas, and if you're in the floodplain or within 100 feet of a floodplain, that contact information would be my number. On the benchmarking side, we really wanted to put some extra effort into understanding the risk out there, and it happened to be a really good time to be doing this kind of work because we had 3 major reports published in 2018 and 2019. 2018, the University of Maryland and Texas A&M Galveston published the growing threat of urban flooding. And then 2019, we had the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine publish their framing the challenge of urban flooding in the United States, and the ASFPM Foundation's urban flooding moving towards resilience. And those are 3 huge reports that City of Fort Worth was fortunate enough to be able to participate in, and were also conveniently timed to help us out with our policy development. When we're talking about working with other cities, we did rely on some benchmarking that we had done for our stormwater management program with Charlotte and Raleigh in North Carolina. And 2 years ago, I had met the floodplain administrator for Fort Collins, who's got an exceptional non-FEMA floodplain management program. So we relied pretty heavily on them to get some information on how they were working to manage those risks. And they helped us get in contact with the folks in Denver, and then also Centennial and unincorporated Arapahoe County in Colorado. Those are some really great resources that we found out of state. And then within Texas, we worked with the City of Dallas and City of Grand Prairie, who are doing similar things with their mapping side. And then Austin and Houston both also have really good flood management programs. The major issues and concerns that we came across were pretty consistent nationwide, and the concerns that we had locally. Inconsistency in the way the flood prone areas are designated. That's one of the issues, and the concern there is when we start adding new flood maps, is that going to confuse professionals involved in the real estate transactions? Everything is kind of driven around the real estate world in Fort Worth, a lot of land transactions, and we want to make sure that we're keeping that process going. Also, a situation is the inconsistency in how the available flood risk information is made to the public. So it's not really well publicized. It's not easy to find a lot of times, and we want to make sure that we're providing that information as well as we can. But we also want to make sure that the information that we provide is not going to be an impact to property values. On the regulatory side, again, inconsistency of how the development of flood-prone areas is managed. We want to make sure that we're applying the same regulatory standards and oversight in a consistent and familiar way so that we're not impeding development. This is where our stakeholders come in. This was a huge undertaking for us. We really began to hear from our residents about flooding in the FEMA, or outside the FEMA floodplain during the development of our floodplain management plan in 2016. By 2017, we had started work on our strategic stormwater management program master plan, and similar public meetings in that process also showed that there was a significant interest in flooding outside of the FEMA floodplains. By 2018, we created our initial policy stakeholder working group to dig into the issue, and we held additional public meetings following that in December of 2018. By 2019, we were working with the Fort Worth Real Estate Council, and they offered to help us by assisting and creating a panel of experts from the real estate industry to help us understand aspects of the real estate transaction process that can be affected by these new regulations. And we called this group the REG, just for short, the Real Estate Guidance Group. And then at the same time, we were working with the American Council of Engineering Companies, who were offering to assist us on the technical side, working with the 2D models that define the CFRAs, and then determine how engineers can assist developers with their projects. There's a lot of information that needs to get provided to the engineering community, and so we met monthly from April through November to get some of those issues nailed down. And then finally, we held a combined ACEC and REG meeting in January 2020, just to make sure everybody was on the same page. This is what our policy stakeholder groups look like. I won't go through each of those just so we can save a little time here, but obviously we had a lot of folks involved, and including the federal folks, FEMA, HUD, and FHA, who were really instrumental in helping us get this policy understood by the major stakeholders. We also had a number of meetings with different real estate engagement or real estate groups. I won't go through each of those either, but we wanted to make sure that we're getting the word out to all of the potential stakeholders as much as we can so that they all have an opportunity to provide some input where necessary. And that brings us to an interesting aspect. One of the things that really our stakeholder engagement did is it caused the Fort Worth Real Estate Council to conduct their very own survey of registered voters ahead of the 2019 election, primarily focused on election issues, but also including 2 questions related to flooding. One of the questions, I guess we got 400 respondents from that survey, and what we found on the flooding question was that 75% of the respondents favored publicly listing areas that have recently flooded, and 66% of the respondents favored having their own property or neighborhood publicly listed as flood prone if flooding were to occur. Now, we weren't looking to list areas, we were just going to do mapping, but the way the question was worded still resulted in some positive responses from that we thought, frankly, was a little bit surprising. So it was good to see that there was that much support and that people are really interested in knowing about flood risk where they live. On to our recommendations. We've really got 2 types of recommendations that we're working on here. We've got communication side and the regulation side, short-term and long-term for both. And by the end of 2020, we want to update our one address tool to include all the flood risk information, not just the FEMA and not just the potential high water, but also include the city flood risk areas as well. And we also want to add the city flood risk areas to our mapping on the zoning website. Right now, the zoning website has only the FEMA floodplain, but we want to really include all the available mapping tools that we have. And we also want to get the potential high water out there on the education side so we can inform folks of what these city flood risk areas and potential high water areas look like. Looking down the road, we'll want to add the potential high water to a dedicated website that has all of our mapping, flood risk mapping on it, and then also update that mapping as appropriate to make sure that it stays current. On the regulatory side, by the end of 2020, we want to require new developments less than an acre in the city flood risk areas to provide a certificate of compliance with existing standards. And this is kind of the loophole that we've got right now. Right now, these projects that are less than an acre receive no review unless they're platting. And so we want to make sure that these smaller projects get some sort of awareness or compliance check to make sure that they're really preventing flood damage on new developments. And we also want to revise by the end of 2020 all of our applicable ordinances and our drainage criteria manual to reflect these new flood risk areas. And then looking down the road, we'll eventually get to a point where we can review plans for the projects that are less than an acre in these city flood risk areas. And that's going to be contingent on staff capacity and then budgeting as well. We already spend over $1 million a year on plan review expenses and consultants, and before we add more to that, we want to make sure we understand how much that risk is going to be from a dollar perspective, and make sure that we're budgeting appropriately and have the ability to fund it through the utility. On our conclusions, on the major concerns, on the mapping side, the names of the floodplains were really what people were hung up on. And so we think that the city flood risk areas and potential high water areas are going to express the flood risk without appearing to be a floodplain. And that was the thing we heard over and over. Please don't call these a floodplain. People won't know what to do. And so we think with the new city flood risk area that expresses that it is a city project or product, and there is a flood risk, and it's not going to be anything that generates a FEMA flood insurance requirement. But lenders can always still require it as part of their loans, and the lenders were interested in this information to see if it warrants including some sort of flood insurance requirement, even if it's outside the FEMA floodplain. And at the end of the day, we think that with education and time, it'll turn out to be business as usual. And that's pretty much what we found talking with the city of Fort Collins, is that the folks up there really understood what it was, and it wasn't a real impediment to the development process now. On the communication side, will it affect property values? There's really a lot of things that affect property values more than just mapping. And the biggest thing that we found was that actual flooding damage was the biggest determining factor in whether or not property value was changed in some way. In the hot markets like Austin and Houston, even if a property is in the FEMA floodplain, it doesn't really affect the property value. And on the regulatory side, will this complicate or impede the development process? Again, it's only those projects that are less than 1 acre and in a city flood risk area that are going to have some additional level of review. Everything that's larger than an acre already sees that kind of review, so it's just really these loophole projects that are going to see some sort of change. And to look at kind of what that change was going to be, kind of how big it was, I went back through all of our 2019 building permits. We had over 14,000 building permits in 2019. And of those, only 12 commercial and 33 residential building permits would have been affected by the new regulations. So 0.3% of 14,000 permits is not a lot, but we want to make sure that we're being able to review those as quickly and efficiently as we can. And then initially, only the certification of compliance is going to be required, so it's not a huge lift for these developments to provide that information. Most of the engineers that we talked with felt like they were going to be handling that information as part of their due diligence. So hopefully that's going to work out well for everyone. And then finally, the local flexibility that we have to deal with these areas as a city flood risk area rather than a FEMA floodplain lets us deal with various flood proofing options or elevation options that maybe may not be available in the FEMA flood zones. On the engagement side, we provided some surveys to our stakeholders. We wanted to make sure we were doing the job we wanted to be doing. And what we found was that 100% of them felt like we listened to their concerns. 92% felt like we understood the potential policy implications. 92% felt like the flood risk information would be useful in their business decision making, and that 92% supported our recommendations. So that's really high percentages of support for what we felt like we were doing, and that was exactly what we're trying to achieve here, is make sure that we're getting the word out to the folks that need it. On the next steps, our final city council briefing is going to be Tuesday, June 16th, next week. And if all goes well from there, by the end of 2020, we'll be finalizing our guidance documents for general use. We'll be working with our key stakeholders on some specific communication and education materials something that's geared towards real estate agents that they can take with them into the field and work with their clients. We'll also refine the mapping before it's placed online, and then finally bring our ordinance changes to the City Council for approval. And with that, I'll close my discussion and open it up for any questions and answers.
Thank you, Claire, for that wonderful presentation. We've got Claire here with this group to answer some questions, and we've got some questions that have come in the Q&A. Claire, Terry wants to know, is your non-FEMA floodplain management impact due to storm water and have damage precipitation events been increasing in your area?
So it is all stormwater related. This is all upstream of all of the FEMA floodplains, and what we're seeing is there's a lot of older historic storm drain systems in the city of Fort Worth, and when they're overwhelmed with runoff, we're dealing with some pretty significant runoff down the streets and between lots. And so that's what we're trying to map with these city flood risk areas and potential high water area maps. It is all stormwater, but the flooding effect is visually similar to any floodplain you'd see anywhere. So that's correct.
Very good. JB would like to know, did your department create the high water shape files, or is this from a national source?
We did create both of those data sets. The potential high water is basically a rain on grid or rain on mesh, however you want to look at that. It's an InfoWorks product that we're looking at updating here to refine some different storm drain capacity areas, but it doesn't have the storm drain systems built into the potential high water. The city flood risk areas do have storm drain capacity, and we account for that. Underground capacity is part of the flooding shown there. And you can tell from that one exhibit that we had that there were two kind of distinct flood zones in that same area. You can see that the potential high water is a little wider than the FEMA, or I'm sorry, than the city flood risk areas. And that's because of the underground storm drain capacity that the city flood risk areas have.
Okay, very good. And Stephanie would like to know if you could confirm the potential high water risk that the user sees and for a specific address includes a FEMA floodplain and urban floodplains.
Yeah, so if you go to the city's one address function and you input any address in the city, it will tell you if it's in a potential high water area within 100 feet of a FEMA floodplain. But it doesn't currently show the city flood risk areas. That's partly because we're still developing a lot of that information, but we should have the city flood risk area information linked to our one address application by the end of the year. So ultimately we'll have all three zones shown.
Very good. And Chris would like to know what model was used for the city's flood risk and potential high water areas.
So as I mentioned before, the city flood risk area, I'm sorry, the potential high water areas are an InfoWorks product. Rain on mesh, it's basically just a precipitation event on a terrain. And so that's similar to like you'd have with some of the BLE type products that use the RAS 2D model. But the city flood risk areas are all built with a 2D model that's capable of showing storm drain capacity as well. So it's frequently an InfoWorks product, but we've also got SWIM models and XP SWIM and I think InfoWorks. I think those are the three main ones that we have for the city flood risk areas.
Very good. But Mono has a question here, and he'd like to know if how helpful it would be for urban flooding mapped, and how would you use urban flooding hazard risk if available in your city programs?
Well, that's really what we're trying to do with this is get a handle on the urban flood risk, which is that risk that's outside the FEMA floodplain. And as you saw in that table that was in the presentation, we've got a lot more flood damage going on outside the FEMA floodplain than inside. And most of our repetitive losses are in this location. So what we want to do is not leave those residents and property owners at risk of flooding without being able to inform them of the risk or to help them construct in a safe kind of way. Right now, there's a loophole that I mentioned that allows developments to go in and potentially build at risk of flooding. So we want to close that loop.
Very good. All right. And Chris would like to know if you could comment on the value of this information to develop the community, to the development community as they develop their property.
That's a big part of it. Part of our stormwater review process for those projects that are greater than an acre includes referencing these models. And so one of the things that was, I guess, frequently a problem for us was the developer would come in with a project in one of these flood-prone redeveloping areas. They wouldn't know about the flood risk, and their engineer wouldn't necessarily know, but then we would inform them that there was this significant flood risk because of these 2D models that we had at the time they're getting their plans reviewed. So the issue was they were frequently kind of blown out of the water with the fact that there's this huge flood risk that they didn't know about, and it caused them to go back and redo all their plans. And so part of this is to get that information out there to the development community ahead of time so that they're aware of the models and the flood risk and can work with those products to develop their site in a safe kind of way.
Very good. We have a question from H. Who's curious about the relationship with ACEC. Was that contractual or free?
It was free. It was a voluntary arrangement. I had made a presentation to their group at one of their monthly meetings, and they followed up with us and said, we'd be glad to work with you to try to define some of the characteristics that we're going to need to look at from an engineering perspective as we serve our developer clients. And we thought that was a perfect type of a synergy, if you will. We were already working with the development community, and the developers were interested in using the information. The next logical step was to have an engineering application take a look at it as well. And by having the ACEC representing multiple firms, we really got a good cross-section of engineering firms that are in our area that are familiar with H&H and really gave us some good input on how to make this information available.
Very good. And Kyle has a question here. He'd like to determine how did you determine the limits of the studies, or what areas became areas of city flood risk? So
the city flood risk areas are really kind of a byproduct of our capital projects scoping program. And so we know citywide we've got a number of flood prone areas that are kind of burdened with these undersized storm drain systems. The 2D models that we prepared were really in order to see what that capital project was going to look like. And frequently it turned out to be a $30 or $40 million solution. So that meant we couldn't solve that problem right then, but we still had this model information that was useful. And so we wanted to make this model information available to anybody that was going to be developing in these basins. So we started putting together a process to make it available. And as soon as we started talking about these flood prone areas that are out there, there got to be a lot of interest in, well, what does that really mean for property values? What does that mean for development permits and processes? So that's really how we got into this program to make the information available.
Very good. And Janice wants to know if the city mapped areas, the standards are the same for those in the special flood hazard area.
The goal is the same for us. We want 2 feet of freeboard over fully developed conditions, which is our regulatory standard in the city. The difference would be that in the city flood risk areas, we're not bound by the same federal requirements for how different properties can be flood proofed. Residential flood proofing is not allowed in the special flood hazard area, but we can allow it in the city flood risk areas so that we can kind of encourage people to develop safely, meet the intent of the regulation, and still have some flexibility in how we deal with these things outside the FEMA floodplain.
Very good. Does the city of Fort Worth require drainage studies for new developments?
Yes. For anything over an acre has to do that with a downstream assessment, and it's these under an acre developments that we're trying to get some sort of drainage analysis on now.
Are you in the community rating system?
Yes, we're currently in 8.
You're currently in 8. What are you getting points for this, or are you applying for credit for it?
We haven't applied for credit for it yet. We're still rolling the program out, and it's still a pretty politically charged issue. We're going to council on the 16th. I'm sorry, that was delayed by a week. So when I put the presentation together, we were going next Tuesday. We're now a week out from that. So everything moves a little bit when we're doing this type of project, but we're intending to go to council and then ultimately have this adopted by the city. Very
good. How do you account for the existing storm drain network and the rain on the grid model?
Well, it's a little ugly right now. We made some assumptions in how the storm drain system would impact overland flow by reducing the amount of precipitation. So if it's a 9-inch rainfall, we subtracted the first inch and assumed that the first inch could be handled by storm drain system. And then after that, everything was going to be overland. So it's sort of an approximation that's not great, but we're working on refining that based on some storm drain ranking, capacity ranking that we've done citywide as well.
Okay. We have one more question here. PC Swim and InfoWorks are not common software. Do you have issues sharing that data with engineers or contractors that do not understand the software?
That is one of the problems that we've got. InfoWorks is expensive and very in-depth hydrology and hydraulic software that's not commonly used everywhere. So it was one of the tools that we decided to use early on in the stormwater management program to help understand our storm drain systems, because we knew we had a large overland flow component of the systems we had. It's served us well, but it doesn't necessarily translate well into the average mom and pop type engineering firm to use it. So we're working to sort out some ways to deal with the model results without having to necessarily work with the model. That's been part of the input that we worked with on the ACEC folks.
Very good. We have one last question here from Jeremy. Are there any thoughts on liability associated with allowing residential floodproofing in lieu of elevation in those city designated areas?
Well, if it's done per the FEMA guidelines, which is what we would recommend, then floodproofing should be floodproofing. It involves a certain amount of owner responsibility as well. It's not as simple as filling or elevating. So for the most part, we expect that to still go to commercial type developments that are going to be operated a little more consistently. But we want to make sure that that option is available for residential folks. We've had a number of requests for that.
Very good. And we got one last question, and then we're going to allow you to respond after your session. You can respond in written form to the questions in the chat.
Right.
Kimberly wants to know, are you considering parking lots or parking below the building as allowable use in flood risk areas?
They can be, as long as there's knowledge that those areas are prone to flooding. There are parking garages in FEMA floodplains now, and a big aspect of what we require those folks to do is make sure there's a plan to get the vehicles out. There's different types of flooding in the city of Fort Worth. We've got the Trinity River flooding, which is really slow. And we've got some other types of flooding on the smaller streams that are flashy. It gets to be more critical to get the vehicles out in a flashy type environment than in the Trinity type environment. So it's kind of a case by case situation, but we do have some parking garages that are below BFE.
Fantastic. Thank you, Claire, for your presentation today. And please follow up with the responses to the chat session.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Oh, fantastic. Our next presenters are Cindy Engelhardt, an engineer, and Kimberly Miller, who are both with Halff and Associates. Cindy is a civil engineer with focus on water resources. She's been there for 15 years with Halff and Associates. She has been involved in numerous floodplain planning and design projects throughout the state of Texas. And she's formed a trusted a trusted working relationship with local, state, and federal agencies. Her co-presenter, Kimberly, has joined Halff and Associates in 2019 as the principal planner for resilience. She has over 20 years experience and began her career in the city of Austin. She has relocated to New York City, leading those efforts after Hurricane Sandy. She also has been involved in the redevelopment after Hurricane Katrina, rebuilding resistance along the Gulf Coast. And over the last 10 years, her projects include community development engagement, comprehensive planning, development services, coastal management planning, waterfront plans, hazard mitigation, and climate adaptation plans. And she is currently the Texas APA's Hurricane Harvey Recovery Task Force chairperson. Cindy and Kimberly are covering the Hays County Progressive Approach to Resilience today. And with that, we're going to turn it over to their presentation.
Good morning and welcome to Hays County Progressive Resilience. I'm Kimberly Miller and I'll be presenting today with my colleague Cindy Engelhardt. We wanted to talk with you today about Hays County and its approach to resilience. It's been a long journey, and the progressive community that they are, they've made a lot of progress since they began. You'll see here a snapshot of what Wimberley looked like after the massive floods of 2015 and 2016, and I'll take you through a visual tour of some of the different impacts of flooding in these 2 years in Hays County communities. So many communities along Texas Flash Flood Alley are prone to rainfall and devastating flooding. This is especially true for Hays County, and in 2016, it was designated the 4th fastest growing county in the nation. And what that means is that more growth, more people are at risk. So due to its location and population growth, Hays County is an area where complete flood mitigation is not financially feasible. So flood resilience in Hays County includes a combination of mitigation projects, higher standards for development, increased flood preparedness, and implementation of flood monitoring systems. Over the past 10 years, Hays County has advanced many of these resilience strategies to reduce flood risks. And here you'll see a turnaround, don't drown example that we're trying to help them avoid from the 2015 Halloween floods. Hays County used a tiered approach with varying levels of analysis to identify flood risk with updated hydrologic and hydraulic studies for over 700 miles throughout the county. As you'll see right here, they really need it. These studies resulted in a roadway bond program to increase high-risk stream crossing improvements and to update their hazard mitigation plan. They've applied to be part of the community rating system through FEMA and are actively seeking grant funding to implement structural flood mitigation and buyout projects for reducing flood risks within the county. Building upon these new studies, Hays County developed an improved flood monitoring system. So ultimately, the identification of Hays County's vulnerabilities led the county to a suite of solutions to help them implement local strategies to protect their citizens and their properties from floods and improve the resilience of the communities that they serve. And this is just a quick snapshot of how all those emergency management workers that we were working with and the leadership of Hays County felt after experiencing the floods of 2015 and 2016. It's really important to think about the local perspective, and we thought this quote said it really well. You're not just talking about what happens when the flood occurs, but we're really looking 10 years down the road, maybe even 15, from the point at which the first raindrop falls until communities are back at home and they're made whole again. And so any damage that we can avoid is damage that helps these communities become more resilient to future flooding. Why is it a great time in Texas to be thinking about resilience? Well, if you'll see from this graph, Texas actually in the last 10 years has experienced a dramatic increase in the number of major storms and the cost of those storms to our bottom line. And because resilience is thrown around a lot, and because it's not always clear what the definition is, our working definition has been what Rockefeller's 100 Resilient Cities program works with. And it's about really reducing the impact of major shocks on a community, but also thinking about those long-term impacts. How do chronic poverty and unemployment and even drought affect what happens to a community and its ability to survive and thrive into the future? So ultimately, resilience is about making a community better and making its people and its properties and its infrastructure less vulnerable. There are a number of different strategies that we can use to approach flood risk management, but we like to frame it in a few different ways. Looking at a traditional sort of armoring approach that protects existing structures from future damage. This is kind of the gray approach, the levee, the seawall that keeps you out of the floodplain or protects you from rising waters for existing development. Accommodation with a little diver over here is really kind of talking about what a lot of communities, Miami, for example, are coming to expect, is that they're going to have to live with some of the future impacts of flooding. Hays County is really no different. I mean, accommodating that sometimes you may actually have water in your yard and maybe in your building, and figuring out how to design our structures so that that is acceptable. Avoiding is where the risk managers and planners come in, finding ways to direct new development, new infrastructure improvement away from and out of the floodplain is what we think of as avoidance. And then finally, retreating, which is really nobody's favorite solution, because that's where we involve people with buying out and relocating. So the way that, as we talked about with the life cycle approach to resilience, the way that our planners work with our water resource engineers, work with our civil engineers, work with our landscape architects, is to begin with the process of identifying the risk, then make plans for mitigation, and then adapt and build creative solutions. So the plans that are on the right are ones that many of you are probably very familiar with. The hazard mitigation plan is the Bible that most of us work off of. The business continuity plan is something that a lot of communities have, either at the private level or even at the public sector level. And then post-disaster recovery plans. What are you going to do to stage your recovery, your cleanup, and get yourself sort of back on track? But what we try to do with Hays County and other clients is to actually bring these benefits of the hazard mitigation plan, the projects we identify as top priorities, into other aspects of how they're planning for their future. Their comprehensive plans, their capital improvement plans, and even their regulations, like updating their floodplain management plans and writing their zoning in a way that works people around the floodplains and high-risk areas. Shoal Creek is one of the areas where we've been extremely active in a very urban setting to try to help the community find ways to reduce flash flooding in Shoal Creek. So each one of the black spots there, the black lines, actually designates a different kind of drainage improvement that's been done to reduce that flooding, the loading into the Shoal Creek corridor, and to reduce the downstream accumulation of water from urban developed areas over time. So that's been a project ongoing for us probably almost as long as Hays County has, but it's an example of how to work in an extremely constrained, very paved urban condition to address some of the same concerns that we're looking at in Hays County. Many of you are probably really familiar with the FEMA statistic that's often used of $1 spent in mitigation is actually the result of $4 savings. Well, in 2019, the National Institute of Building Sciences actually determined that riverine flooding that occurred in areas that were using the most updated codes by the National Institute of Building Sciences are receive a 6-to-1 benefit of every dollar invested, then results in $6 of savings for flood costs, for flood reduction. And so what are the kind of factors that go into that? Well, it's reduction in death and injury, reduced costs for repair of damaged buildings and their contents, reduced loss associated with business interruption and revenues to local governments, sheltering people who are displaced by a storm, and a number of other factors. But these are all things that go into the cost calculation that leads to a ratio of saying $1 spent in mitigation is $6 saved. And finally, what good is a plan without a funding source? And so we wanted to make you all aware that Texas has a number of different opportunities to be looking at its major investment needs and priorities to reduce as a whole state its risk of flood impacts over the next generation. So there are a couple of different state agencies that are running funds that particularly address these issues. The Water Development Board State Flood Planning and Flood Infrastructure Fund were established with the assistance of the most recent legislature. And the General Land Office CDBG mitigation dollars are a continuation of the 2015, 2016, and Harvey disaster recovery programs, and are an opportunity for communities to take some of those projects that might have been sitting on their CIP or in their hazard mitigation plan for a long time and find a way to match them up with a no match funding through the competitions that are available, that are starting right now, and the application deadline for those go through 2020, October 2020. And then the FEMA BRIC program is a replacement for the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program that many of you know and love, that is focused much more on helping us build more resilient communities than previous FEMA programs, which were focused on mitigation, but didn't necessarily allow you to go as far as you as a floodplain manager might want to go, knowing what you know about your community. So even FEMA has gone from a recovery to a mitigation mindset, and that's what I think we see in there. So with that, I'd like to turn the conversation over to Cindy Engelhardt, who can delve deeply into the things that she's been able to do with Hays County over the last decade.
Thanks so much, Kimberly. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the strategies that Hays County has used. And in my opinion, they're a very progressive community. I think they're a very good example for a lot of our areas in Texas that, you know, started off as rural. They're rapidly growing, and they realized they had a lot of flood events and other things, and started really working on this progressive approach to resilience and implementing a lot of resilient strategies. I will admit that we did not necessarily call them resilient strategies when we started, but after the floods in 2007, they did their first application for some flood studies. They started on the northern half of the county, moved to the southern half of the county, and from there kind of moved into a lot of other resilient strategies throughout the years. The rain clouds on here indicate when they had some heavy rain events or some devastating floods through the county. They are in flash flood alleys, so they're no stranger to floods. From 2017, 2013, 2 in 2015, 2016, as well as 2019. Hays County has along the way just continued to add to the resilient strategies and becoming more flood resilient in the process. So stepping through these, we're going to talk about their modeling and mapping. There's 8 steps. We're going to talk about their modeling and mapping. We're going to talk about their risk ranking of streams, a roadway bond program, updates to their hazard mitigation plan. They are always seeking funding for a lot of implementation of mitigation projects. They're updating their criteria through a criteria manual and floodplain regulations, as well as seeking to participate in the community rating system. So starting with the modeling and mapping, Hays County partnered with the Lower Colorado River Authority for the northern half of the county and flood studies through that portion. They then also partnered with the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority, and both of the studies included participation from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, local participants, and the Texas Water Development Board through a flood protection planning grant. And what they did with these flood studies is they were able to do some floodplain studies and really define where that risk is within their area, as well as take a look at some mitigation alternatives for some particular streams and areas. So this graphic here is showing you all of the dark blue streams and the light blue streams. They're a little bit hard to see, but we studied over 700 miles of floodplains. And they also evaluated or performed dam breach analyses on 5 dams in the Upper San Marcos watershed, 5 dams in the Plum Creek watershed, as well as that conceptual alternatives analysis, and trying to identify projects that could potentially be cost beneficial and seek some grant funds and other things. They also take a look at stream crossings. Hays County is a little bit notorious for their low water crossings, and they knew that they needed to take a look and understand their risk associated with those crossings. So a lot of things really built upon this original floodplain analysis. Taking a step into those is the risk ranking of stream crossings. So they analyzed over 220 stream crossings. They took a look at the frequency of risk and overtopping. They looked at average daily traffic. And basically, the highest score of the multiplication of those together equaled the greatest flood risk. So coming out of those, they also understood that they had the information necessary, such as the water service elevation and stream discharge, to understand if they needed a culvert or if they needed a bridge. So they applied that to the bond program and started working towards updates to those low water crossings. They also used this risk ranking to identify where stream gauges should go and where they were having a lot of damages or potentially needed some flashers and other things to warn vehicles. So through the transportation bond, we were able to take that stream risk ranking and look at that per precinct. So from there, we were able to talk to the commissioners and other things and identify if the data aligned with what they were hearing in their jurisdictions. And from there, they assigned and figured out how to improve high risk low water crossings through the bond program. It should be noted that about 60% of the stream crossings in Hays County are overtopped by the 2-year flood event. So they've got a ways to go, but they're really doing a good job moving forward and updating those crossings. Moving into mitigation projects, as I mentioned, the flood studies took a high-level look at a lot of mitigation projects. So from there, they were able to kind of drill those down and figure out what grant programs they might apply for. The county is actively seeking funds through the General Land Office, the Texas Division of Emergency Management, as well as the Texas Water Development Board. And those are generally grant programs through FEMA or HUD, but they're administered by different programs in Texas. So they're looking at CDBG, DR funds, HMGP, flood mitigation assistance, as well as pre-disaster mitigation assistance. And some of the types of projects that they're looking for, they have some buyout programs of repetitive loss structures. They also have some mitigation projects. They have multiple streams in Hays County that tend to merge into one another. So that really impacts mobility as well as a lot of residential structures and even some functions of the government center and other things. So they are seeking some funds to update some of those other areas, as well as some local flooding. So it's not just main stem riverine flooding that they are experiencing in the county. They also have a lot of local flooding due to growth and development before there was a criteria and before drainage infrastructure was put in place. Some of the other ways that they're moving forward is drainage criteria manuals. So they are looking to establish some methodologies. Previously, they kind of relied a lot on the TxDOT criteria and some of the other criteria, nearby criterias, but they have a desire to create their own. And in that, they're defining what hydrology and hydraulics is and how that should be performed. It also does include Atlas 14 rainfall. So they are suggesting that they need to be using that Atlas 14 rainfall, but it also defines a lot of other ideas within the county and the methodologies necessary. This is going to kind of help with two things. It's going to help on the development side of knowing exactly what to do, when, and how. But it's also going to help on the review side where everything is coming in a consistent manner and they're able to review that. County staff can keep up with that stuff better. And they're looking at floodplain regulations and higher standards. So they're also taking a look at the community rating system. The community rating system awards points and other things for these 4 items here, all of which Hays County is doing. So they're very good at public information, especially with all the floods and awareness that they have going on. Mapping and regulations. So those are the 2 things that we've mentioned. They have updated 700 stream miles of mapping, and they're working on their regulations, as well as flood damage reduction. That is, they are working towards those mitigation projects and trying to figure out ways to reduce that risk. as well as warning and response. So Hays County, we haven't talked about it just yet, but they have also implemented a flood monitoring system. So Hays County is doing a lot of these items, and they're ready to get credit for that, and potentially reduce flood insurance premiums. Hays County has 1,064 policies in the county with approximately $600,000 in premiums. And so any reduction to those premiums would be a really big benefit to the Hays County residents. They're also working on hazard mitigation plans. I'm sure you have heard about hazard mitigation plans. They tend to be discussed a lot more. They're not just something to put on the shelf anymore, and hopefully they weren't before, but a lot of folks were doing a checkbox and just checking that off the list. But as Kimberly mentioned, a lot of these new grant programs and other things that are moving into this mitigation require that the projects be identified in a hazard mitigation plan. So Hays County and 11 communities updated their hazard mitigation plan, which included a new risk assessment, identification of projects per each natural hazard, as well as evaluating projects to see if they were FEMA funding or eligible for FEMA funding. Moving into their flood monitoring system, Hays County worked with the Texas Water Development Board to apply for a grant to install gauges and other things. And what really prompted this was the 2015 flood on the Blanco River. Late one evening, the emergency manager received a call from a landowner that lived upstream near the Blanco County line. And he told them it was bad and they needed to get people out of harm's way. So apparently he was very close with these folks and very trusted man, because they listened to him and they got a lot of folks out of harm's way before that big flood came down, rushing down the Blanco River. So rather than always relying on our upstream folks, they have decided to install several gauges. So it's precipitation gauges, 5 reservoir gauges, 27 gauges at their low water crossings, and 4 crossing cameras. So not only are they looking at the data that's coming in, a couple of these had the need for some cameras, and with that you can kind of watch that flood come and go and validate that the results on your computer are appropriate. Some of the things that they have in here is they have a public and a private web monitoring web maps, and so those have been really helpful. Some of the things that they display on the private side, they display some live information, which shows maybe some inundation floodplains and other things based on the gauge readings. When a gauge reaches a certain level, a particular floodplain turns on. So those are helpful on the response side and trying to understand inundation extents. But they also have a public-facing web map that tells people in the community which roads are closed and which ones they need to avoid, or what is happening in the area. And as a continuation, they have expanded, or they're working on expanding the flood monitoring system by adding an additional 5 reservoir gauges, 5 precipitation gauges, and additional low water crossing gauges. So what do these look like? These are some of the dams, and this is some of the information that is coming out of it. This is what a gauge looks like over on the left. You can see what looks kind of like a little hydrograph in the middle here. That's just some of the results coming out when it gets really high and then starts to kind of taper off. But all these have been really helpful in understanding their flood risk and understanding what types of response may be necessary for the varying flood events that occur out here. Similarly, they have gauges at crossings, and these crossings kind of tell you whether a road is open or closed. But in some of the viewers and the other things, they're able to see some of the flood monitoring or warnings that are going from the National Weather Service, but they're also able to see the radar and projections. And then again, this is a picture of their cameras, and as you can tell, they're really pretty good. You get to watch a lot of really neat floods come and go. Hopefully they don't ever get to the top of a road or other things, but nerds like me really enjoy that kind of thing. Hopefully everybody is safe, and that's what these are implemented to do, is to just get us ahead of some of this danger and be able to warn the folks downstream. So again, Hays County didn't do this overnight. They have been working on resilient strategies since 2007, probably before that as well. But 2007 is when we started really talking about these things. And somewhere along the line, we turned them into calling it resilience. But they've set a really good example for a lot of communities, and we just wanted to display that here today, because that means you can do it too. It doesn't have to happen overnight. You don't have to eat the whole cake at once. Do some bite sizes and piece off what you can and what's manageable for your community, but always leading towards resilience.
Thank you, Cindy and Kimberly, for sharing the Hays County's progressive approach to resiliency. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat window, and I'm going to ask Cindy to address the questions regarding the acronyms and to wrap up with closing comments with Cindy and Kimberly at this time. Cindy?
Thanks. Hey, sorry about that, guys. We do tend to use too many acronyms as we're speaking. Some of the ones that were directly asked are TWDB, that is the Texas Water Development Board. The GLO is the General Land Office, and that is our Texas General Land Office. BRIC is Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, and that's going to be a new program that's going to replace the pre-disaster mitigation grants from FEMA this year. And moving into some of the closing remarks, I hate to say that Hays County couldn't join us today, and they aren't here with us now, but obviously you've seen all the really great things they have done over the years. They are absolutely setting the way for communities, really explaining how rural areas can take flood risk into their own hands, and it doesn't have to be all at once. They definitely took this into bite-sized pieces, and at the time we started, we weren't quite using that resilience term, but it really is what they're moving towards. They are moving towards the reduction of risk in their communities, and I could not be more proud of them or happy to work with them. So I just wanted to tell them thank you. Kimberly, did you want to wrap up it with anything about resilience?
Sorry, I was muted to try to keep from interfering with background noise with Cindy's closing comments. But I just wanted to say that one of the really positive things about working with Cindy and working as an urban planner with the water resources team is that we're able to look at the ways that large-scale policy issues, environmental issues that planners usually deal with interact with the way that Cindy's approaching things from a flood modeling and flood risk perspective. And so Hays County is an example of the kind of approach that we take towards helping communities become much more prepared over the long run. And as I'm sure you all know, the earlier you're involved, the better ability that you have to help a community build long-term, long-lasting resilience. So we really have appreciated this relationship with Hays County.
Very good. Cindy, we have a question here. It says, are you aware of Hays County officials if they're going to adopt the higher standards? And if so, how was their public reaction to the proposed amendments? Just curious, Nate's in the process of working with his local government to do that.
Absolutely, and they're still working through that process. So it has been a while, and they're still working towards those. They do believe that they have had the previous damages in place to really warrant those higher standards. And I do feel they will get there eventually, but the process is not fast.
Very good. With the installation of the gauges, Alicia wants to know, is Hays County also considering a reversed, activating a reverse 4 call 911 type situation for flood warning?
Yes, they do have a lot of these actions in place already, and so they are using, there's kind of two sides to the gauges and the other things. They have a side that is used for more of their private viewing and the emergency response, and they continue to build upon that side. But they also have that forward-facing website and other things where the general public can go in and see what roadways are closed and other things that might impact them. But one of the other things that I didn't quite mention in the presentation, but with the gauge installation, they also installed quite a bit of flashers and other things. And some of these, given the rural nature of Hays County, they are quite a bit of ways from the crossing itself. So you don't get down a long roadway and then decide you've got to turn around. So when the flashers are on, that really does indicate that water is either over the road or very near over the roadway top.
Very good. Kimberly, did you want to add anything to that? Very good.
No, I think Cindy covered that. Yeah.
Very good. Well, I want to thank everyone for attending the session today. This concludes our session, and we will be ready for the next sessions beginning in 4 minutes. Thank you for
Thank you so much.
your time, and thank you, Cindy, Kimberly, Claire, and Josh, for your comments. If you have any questions, please type those into the chat box, and the presenters will be available after hours to answer those questions. Thank you, and have a nice day.